doesn't say worship, you know, as you go, but there was a time he had to take and the sacrifice he had to make. And so all of that was there. So with worship, it's going to be defined by God as, hey, this is what worship is and this is what proper worship is, as we talked about last week. And so you have the Lord's Supper, which we talked about in detail. We call communion sometimes because we're fellowshipping together with each other, but also there's communion and fellowship with Christ, with God on that day. There's praying, there's preaching, singing, giving, and we talked about singing, how when God specified something, just like when he specified, you know, the specific kind of wood, it eliminated the others, and so when God specified the kind of music, it eliminated all the instruments, it eliminated different types of non-instrumental music. You might say vocal is one way to say that. Vocal music is something that I listen to, so vocal may be the best way to say it. And I think everybody understood that. Were there any questions on that? Does that still make sense generally? You may continue to ask questions, and again, questions are not bad. Questions they help us learn. So we're not going to say don't ask questions. All right, let's do giving. Let's do giving next. So why do we give on the first day of the week would be a question to you. Any thoughts? Why would we give on the first day of the week? And again, if you don't know, then that's kind of why we're here to learn. Let's look at let's go to Acts. We're pretty much always going to go to Acts for the most part when it comes to, you know, New Testament worship, because that's when the church was established, and New Testament, all kinds of things that, you know, you want to look at the early church and what they were doing. So let's go to Acts chapter. I want to think about the exact chapter to go to. I have another one in mind for something else, but this chapter here, Acts 4, I think is where we need to go. Acts 4. And it's in verse, look at Acts 4, verse 32. Acts 4, verse 32. Are we there? Working on it. Acts 4, 32. He says, the multitude of those who believed, so speaking about Christians, right? This is speaking about the church, the multitude, the gathering of people who believed, were of one heart and one soul. So they had this oneness together. They were one in their heart, their mindset. Nor did anyone say that any of the things he possessed was his own, but they had all things in common. And so the early church, as they've just begun, perhaps weeks before this, they now there's some people in need, right? There's always going to be people in need, as was prayed for by Tom over there moments ago. There will be people in need, and even church people in need. And so basically he's saying that they shared everything, right? It was something that they shared a lot of things together. Now, were they required to do that? No. I don't think that they're doing that because they feel required to share everything, right? So I want you to think about, I don't think God is going to make us share everything. There will be some things he does want us to share, and he gives us the opportunities to do that. And we'll talk about this giving when it comes to worship a little bit more. So this is not necessarily an example of worship, but there's the example of, as they're together, they're providing for one another, okay? So they're providing for one another. That's what's happening here. Y'all remember in Acts 5, Ananias and Sapphira? Remember that story? Okay, so they sold land, and they came to Peter, and what did they do? Do you remember exactly? They sold land, they came to Peter, and basically were like, hey, we sold it for this much, and they lied. They lied about what they sold it for. Yes, they both instantly died, and they did that separately. I don't know if they agreed or what, but either way, they were trying to lie. They lied to God in doing so because they, said, hey, we don't know exactly why they did it, but they did it, and it was wrong, and they were punished for it. So I'm glad y'all at least have a little bit of a memory there on that. So that's Acts 5. We just saw in Acts 4 they were sharing together. And so Ananias and Sapphira, they kind of liked that idea, but they used it in a bad way there as you begin that chapter. So then I want us to go to what the church does a little bit later in 1 Corinthians. So turn over, you have Acts, Romans, and then 1 Corinthians. Go all the way to chapter 16, which is the very end of it. And we're going to look at 1 Corinthians 16, verses 1 and 2. Hazen, if you're there, would you read that for us?
Now about the collection for the Lord's people. Do what I told the Galatian churches to do. On the first day of every week, each one of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with your income, saving it up, so that when I come, no collections will have to do.
All right, thank you. So he says a couple things here that we need to note about giving, that there's a collection. What kind of collection? Is it of toys and clothes, or what are they collecting? Money, right? So there's money being collected. And who is Paul? Is Paul an apostle? Do apostles have authority from God to command things? Yes. So he gives a command, and he says that I'm giving this command to the Corinthian church, right, to Corinth. But he says I also gave this command to multiple churches in Galatia, which is a big region and in a different place. He says, I gave them this command, I given you this command. And Paul says later elsewhere, I teach the same thing in every church I go to. Wouldn't that make sense, right, to teach the same thing? And so Paul says, Paul is probably going to teach that everywhere, that money should be collected, and he talks about when that should be collected as well. So it's collected on when? What does it say in verse 2? The first day of the week. Now, why would that make sense? What are the Christians doing every first day of the week? They're gathering together. Yes, very good. So, on the first day of the week, it makes sense to come together and say, look, I've prospered in this way. I had maybe some extra this week. And then next week you come back like, I don't have that much, but I have this. And so we're going to give what we prospered, some of what we prospered, however much we want to give. There's a difference in the Old Testament was, I know you've heard this word, but tithe, right? Tithing just means a tenth. So you can think about it like a tenth, fractions. Maybe that's not your favorite part of school. It's not my favorite, fractions and all that, math. But tithe was basically a tenth. And so we just kind of take the word that they used. And they were giving a tenth of portions of their things in the Old Testament, right? Under the old law of Moses, they were giving a tenth of their crops or their sheep or, cattle and things like that, and some of their money. And other things as they go. So, but we don't tithe in the New Testament. We do this collection. We give, right? It's a voluntary, but at the same time, every Christian is required. Does that make sense? Is that we're not going to require visitors to, we pass the plate, but we don't, force it. Say, hey, you got to put something in, right? Like that's not what we're doing. And we often actually discourage that because we want Christians to be collecting money together because there's a reason for it. So look at what he says in verse 2. On the first day of the week, so that's the keys. That has to happen every week, right? The Sabbath came around every week in the Old Testament. So every Sabbath they partook, they rested. Well, every first day of every week they collect money. And so you've got to, when you become a Christian, you will start giving, or at least you should. and you're going to give as you've been prospered. Let's say you start giving and yet you don't really have a full-time job yet, right? You're not expected to give as much as maybe someone who does, or someone who has 2 or 3 jobs. So money is a must. It must be collected by Christians on the first day of the week, and so that's where we get our giving, right? It's a sacrifice, and it's really one of the few physical sacrifices we give, right? You think about prayer, it's spiritual. You don't see the prayer going up. Singing, we can hear it, and there's some physical aspect to it, but it's still, you can't really see it. Preaching the same way, and then the Lord's Supper has a physical element, but giving is the other one. There's, we're giving back to God as He gave us, His only Son. So that's kind of 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2 is the biggest key that you would want to go to when somebody were to ask, why do you give every week? Well, because. And remember, I said that your potential friends now or in the future, they will ask you, why is it you take the Lord's Supper every Sunday? Because that's not something other churches do. It's not. Some do. I'm not saying nobody else does. I'm saying that there are many who don't see that as a requirement every Sunday, and I cannot see that as any different. It has to be done on the Lord's day, the first day of the week in which Jesus rose. Well, the same thing with giving. Some people these days are thinking, well, we don't have to give. He says that it's not a tenth anymore, right? It's not a tithe. We're not required. Well, Christians are, and he says because Paul is teaching this in every church. Make sense? Are there questions? All right. If I'm ever being confusing, please tell me. I won't be offended, right? I want you to understand it at least. I'm not expecting you to go be able to teach this to somebody else tonight or tomorrow, but just maybe keep these things in your mind. So, all right, let's look at prayer and preaching. Why is it that we pray together on the Lord's Day together? Where would we start, you think? Yes, Acts, right? So back in Acts 2, remember last week we looked at Acts 2 in verse 41 and 42. And so the early church was just, 3,000 have been saved on that day. And then in verse 42 of Acts 2, it says that they continued steadfastly in doctrine and fellowship, in the breaking of bread, and in prayers, right? So in praying. So Acts 2 and verse 42 is where we would get this idea of the early church. Every time they are meeting together, it's to pray as well, right? What's another verse that you know of for Christians to be praying all the time? Pray without ceasing, right? So that's 1 Thessalonians 5, I think verse 17. So pray without ceasing, that's talking to Christians. Well, so wouldn't that include on the Lord's Day we should be praying? And praying together, though, is seen in this example. So we aren't given the same kind of commands that you might think about when it comes to prayer. We don't have God saying, all right, pray 6 times on Sunday, right? That's not we don't have that. It's just pray. And when we're together, and we're already together, and we're doing these other actions of worship, we should probably pray as well, because we, invoke God's help in prayer. All right, so that's one place, and there's many more we could go to prove that prayer should be part of the assembling together and should be a part of just normal everything. But look there at Acts 2 verse 42, and you'll see the other point in which it says they continued in the apostles' doctrine. So, who's teaching on that day? Is Peter an apostle? Yes, right? Would Paul be an apostle later on? Yes, and he writes a lot of the New Testament. So you continue in all the apostles' teaching, and they're not going to teach something different, right? If it's from God and from the Holy Spirit, they're not going to teach something different. They're going to teach the same thing in every place that they go. And so you have them teaching. Doctrine is just teaching. That's the idea. And preaching is what you get when it comes to a public setting, that they're going to publicly preach the Word of God Doctrine is just, what's being taught is kind of the different, even though it's hot here and, maybe this has become a desert one day, but you have them and their culture. There's some cultural things that are different, but when it comes to the things that we see them doing every Lord's Day as God is helping to establish the church, they're taking Lord's Supper. And let me ask you this. Are any of these more important than the other? Should we say like, oh, well, we'll do just the preaching and nothing else? No, we can't do that because we see them doing all of these things. And we don't need to, look at the Lord's Supper as if it is, worth more than these other things. And we don't need to minimize it too, right? So how quickly do we sometimes partake of this Lord's Supper? Does that go pretty quick? Do you think it is? I'm just honestly asking. You might think it's long, and that's fine. Yes, no? Think it's quick or long? Think about, you know how long my sermons are usually? They're about 25 minutes, give or take. They're some are under, some are a little bit over, but they're really not too much different than that. So they're about 25 minutes this past year. We take about maybe 5 minutes total for communion. I think sometimes we ought to maybe open that up a little bit more, think about it more, because as we talked about, we're supposed to be remembering the death of Jesus, remembering what he did for us on the cross, and so it's an important thing. But all of these are important. I want that to be clear. All of these are important, and we don't need to add to or take away from these things. Any questions on any of that? We good? Makes sense? Okay, so next week, Lord willing, we'll get into James again. I know that this was kind of a sidestep from James, but the focus was because we're talking about James, and James says that we're under the law of liberty, right? And some people said, well, because it's a law that's freeing, it's a law of freedom, we have, no rules. And well, these are some rules, right, that we've got to participate in. And every Christian is required to participate in all of these every first day of the week. All right, so the bonus question was, is it sinful, or would it be sinful to partake of the Lord's Supper on a different day of the week? What do you think? You think no? Thoughts? I won't hold you to anything. Let's just go back to and think about, what day did the early church partake? What day of the week? Sunday, the first day of the week. And we see that happening. There's no other examples. You can look through your New Testament, and you can see that I'm proven right, that there are no other examples of them taking it at like a wedding or at some other case, unless maybe if the wedding was on a Sunday, right? There may be, but again, I think there's a difference between gathering with the church, God's people, and gathering at the wedding where, there's not really, that's not the purpose of gathering, right? Does that make sense? Is that you're gathering for a wedding, why would you take the Lord's Supper? So I just think that we should make sure that we do what the early church did, and they only did it on Sunday. And so you come to the worship service and you are there with God's people, you should partake of the Lord's Supper as long as you're a Christian, right? You've been baptized into Christ, and you need to partake. And partaking on another day, I believe, would be sinful. Because, remember what we talked about in this case. Remember when God specified the gopher wood for the ark, and that eliminated the other things? So when God specifies the day, he specified the day here, just like he specified singing. He specified the day on which we are to partake. He also specified the elements, right? So the symbols of Jesus' body and his blood are the unleavened bread and the grape juice. So the same reason we wouldn't change those to something else, it's the same reason we shouldn't change the day on which we take. Does that make sense? Okay. Hope that's clear, but I'll tell you, a lot of people don't understand this. Some refuse to understand it, but most are just not taught. And so that's why I wanted to teach you these things. What's happening out there? Is there something?